Chuck Berry gave Keith Richards one guitar lesson. What he taught him changed rock forever. It was March 8, 1963, backstage at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, London. The Rolling Stones had just finished opening for Chuck Berry, and 19-year-old Keith Richards was feeling like the worst guitarist who had ever picked up an instrument. Chuck Berry gave Keith Richards one guitar lesson. What he taught him changed rock forever. The 15 minutes that transformed a struggling young musician into one of rock's greatest guitarists happened in the most unlikely place, and what Chuck Berry showed him that day became the foundation of every Rolling Stones song you've ever loved. Chuck Berry had just performed a masterful set, making his guitar sing and dance in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Every note was perfect, every bend precisely placed, every chord change executed with a confidence that came from years of defining what rock and roll guitar should sound like. The Rolling Stones were still nobodies then, a scrappy blues band that had formed less than a year earlier. They were lucky to get gigs opening for real stars, but nights like this one made Keith question whether he belonged on stage at all. Keith, on the other hand, had spent the Stones' opening set fighting his guitar more than playing it. His fingers kept slipping on the frets, his timing was off, and worst of all, when he tried to play Chuck Berry songs the way Chuck Berry played them, they sounded like pale imitations performed by someone who didn't understand what made them special. After the Stones set, Keith had retreated to a corner of the cramped backstage area, replaying every mistake in his head. His bandmates were excited about opening for Chuck Berry, but Keith felt like a fraud. Here he was, sharing a stage with his guitar hero, and he couldn't even play the man's songs properly. Keith was so lost in his self-doubt that he didn't notice Chuck Berry approaching until the legend was standing right next to him. "You're the guitar player," Chuck said. "It wasn't a question. I watched your set," Chuck continued, his voice warm but serious. "You've got something, but you're fighting yourself up there. What's eating you, son?" Keith looked up, startled. Chuck Berry, the man who had written Johnny B. Good and Roll Over Beethoven, was talking to him. Keith tried to speak, but only managed to nod. Keith finally found his voice. "I can't play your songs the way they're supposed to be played. Every time I try it sounds wrong, like I'm missing something fundamental." Chuck nodded knowingly. "What do you think you're missing?" Chuck Berry smiled, the same smile that had charmed audiences across America and now across the Atlantic. "Show me your guitar." "I don't know," Keith admitted. "The feel, maybe? The timing? I can play all the notes, but it doesn't sound like what you do." "Listen," Chuck said, and he began playing the opening riff to Sweet Little 16, but he played it slowly, much slower than the recorded version, breaking down each note so Keith could hear exactly what was happening. "You're trying to play it like you heard it on the record," Chuck explained. "But the record is the end result. You need to understand what comes before that." Keith handed over his battered Hofner, the cheap instrument that was all a struggling musician could afford. Chuck examined it for a moment, then plugged it into a small practice amp in the corner of the backstage area. Chuck played the riff again, even slower this time. Rock and roll guitar isn't about playing fast or playing a lot of notes. It's about playing the right notes at exactly the right time, with exactly the right attitude. The spaces? Keith was confused. Keith watched Chuck's fingers intently, but Chuck shook his head. "Don't watch my fingers. Listen to the spaces. Every note you don't play is as important as every note you do play," Chuck explained. "Most young guitarists think more is better. More notes, more speed, more everything. But rock and roll is about subtraction, not addition." Chuck demonstrated, playing a simple riff but emphasizing the pauses, the brief moments of silence that gave the notes around them power and meaning. The spaces between the notes. That's where the groove lives. That's what makes people move when they hear it. "Now here's the secret that took me years to learn," Chuck said, leaning closer. "Rock and roll guitar isn't about showing people how well you can play. It's about making people feel something. And the only way to make people feel something is if you feel it first." Keith was beginning to understand, but Chuck wasn't finished. Chuck handed the guitar back to Keith. "Play Sweet Little 16, but don't try to play it like me. Play it like you." Keith paused, considering the question. It means being young and wanting something more. It means Saturday nights and hoping something exciting will happen. It means the feeling of possibility." "Stop," Chuck said gently. Before you play a single note, I want you to think about what this song means to you. Not what it means to me. Not what it means to the people who bought the record. What does it mean to you? Keith was nervous. He was about to play Chuck Berry's song in front of Chuck Berry himself, and he was being told to make it his own. His hands were shaking slightly as he positioned his fingers on the frets. Chuck nodded approvingly. "That's it. That's what I was waiting to hear. Now play that," Chuck said. Keith began playing, and something magical happened. He wasn't trying to copy Chuck Berry anymore. He was trying to express his own understanding of what the song represented. The notes were the same, but the feeling behind them was different, personal, authentic, but the lesson wasn't over. Chuck took the guitar back and began playing a rhythm pattern that Keith had never heard before. Chuck demonstrated, playing a solid rhythm pattern with his thumb and fingers while simultaneously picking out melodic lines with his other fingers. It was like watching someone play two guitars at once. "This is something I learned from the blues players in St. Louis," Chuck explained. "It's called the rhythm and lead technique. Most bands have a rhythm guitarist and a lead guitarist, but what if one person could do both? The key is to think of your guitar as a complete band," Chuck explained. "You're not just playing notes, you're playing the bass line, the rhythm, and the melody all at the same time." Chuck showed Keith how to use his thumb to hit the bass notes, while his fingers picked out the higher strings. It was a technique that required coordination and practice, but Keith could immediately see how powerful it could be. "This is how you make 5 guys sound like 10 guys, Chuck said with a grin. "This is how you fill up a room with just one guitar." Chuck began playing a riff that seemed simple, but had an irresistible groove to it. Keith found himself nodding along before he even realized it. "One more thing," Chuck said, taking the guitar for the final time. "Rock and roll is dance music. If people aren't moving when you play, you're doing something wrong." Keith tried the technique, and while his first attempts were clumsy, he could feel the potential in it. This wasn't just a guitar technique. It was a completely different approach to thinking about the instrument. "The drummer keeps time," Chuck said. "The bass player keeps the bottom end, but the guitarist controls the feel. You decide whether people dance or just listen." "Feel that?" Chuck asked. "That's the pocket. That's where the magic lives. It's not about playing perfectly, it's about playing in the pocket." Chuck explained how the slight push and pull of timing could make the difference between music that sounded mechanical and music that felt alive. He showed Keith how to play slightly ahead of the beat for energy, slightly behind for groove, and exactly on the beat for power. The entire lesson had lasted only 15 minutes, but Keith felt like his understanding of the guitar had been completely transformed. Chuck Berry hadn't just shown him techniques. He had revealed an entire philosophy of playing that Keith had never considered. As Chuck walked away, Keith was left alone with his guitar and a head full of new ideas. He began practicing the techniques Chuck had shown him, but more than that, he began thinking about the guitar in a completely different way. "Practice what I showed you," Chuck said as he prepared to leave. "But more importantly, find your own voice. The world doesn't need another Chuck Berry. It needs the first Keith Richards." The first fruits of this transformation became apparent during the recording sessions for the Rolling Stones' debut album later in 1963. Keith's guitar playing had developed a distinctive sound that was clearly influenced by Chuck Berry, but uniquely his own. Most importantly, Keith began developing his own sound, using Chuck Berry's principles but applying them to his own musical vision. He started writing riffs that combined the groove of Chuck Berry's rhythm playing with his own raw, aggressive edge. Over the next few months, Keith threw himself into developing his playing style based on Chuck Berry's lesson. He practiced the rhythm and lead technique until he could play bass lines and melodies simultaneously without thinking about it. He experimented with timing, learning to play in the pocket that Chuck had described. But the real breakthrough came when Keith began applying Chuck Berry's lessons to original material. The riff for Satisfaction, written in 1965, was a direct descendant of the techniques Chuck had taught him that night in Richmond. Keith played a rhythm pattern that was both driving and melodic, filling up the entire sonic space while leaving room for Mick Jagger's vocals. When the Stones recorded their version of Chuck Berry's Route 66, Keith's guitar work showed the influence of that backstage lesson. He played both rhythm and lead parts simultaneously, creating a fuller sound than most bands achieved with multiple guitarists. That riff came from what Chuck taught me about playing rhythm and lead at the same time. Keith would later explain in interviews, I wasn't trying to show off. I was trying to make the song feel complete with just one guitar. Chuck Berry, meanwhile, watched Keith's development with pride and satisfaction. In interviews throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Chuck often mentioned Keith Richards as one of the young musicians who truly understood what rock and roll guitar was about. The rhythm and lead technique that Chuck had demonstrated became one of Keith's signature sounds, particularly evident in songs like Start Me Up, Brown Sugar, and Jumpin' Jack Flash. In each of these songs, Keith's guitar provided both the rhythmic foundation and the melodic hook, creating music that was both powerful and catchy. The influence of Chuck Berry's lesson extended far beyond Keith Richards himself. As the Rolling Stones became one of the world's biggest bands, Keith's guitar style influenced countless other musicians. Young guitarists studied Keith's playing the same way Keith had once studied Chuck Berry's, and Chuck's lessons were passed down through generations of rock musicians. The two musicians remained friends throughout their careers, and whenever their paths crossed, Chuck would always ask Keith about his playing and offer encouragement and advice. Keith got it, Chuck said in a 1972 interview. A lot of these young cats can play fast and play loud, but Keith understood that it's not about impressing people with your technique. It's about making them feel something. In 1986, when Chuck Berry was inducted into the first class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Keith Richards was chosen to present the award. In his speech, Keith referenced that backstage lesson from 1963. Bands like Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, and later Nirvana all used variations of the approach that Chuck had taught Keith that night in Richmond. Jimmy Page's work on Whole Lotta Love, Angus Young's riffs on Back in Black, and Kurt Cobain's playing on Smells Like Teen Spirit all showed the influence of the rhythm and lead technique. Chuck Berry didn't just teach me how to play guitar, Keith said. He taught me how to think about music. He showed me that the most important thing isn't how many notes you can play, but which notes you choose to play and when you choose to play them. The lesson also had broader implications for rock music as a whole. Keith's style, derived from Chuck Berry's teachings, helped establish the template for rock guitar that countless bands would follow. The idea of one guitarist covering both rhythm and lead parts became a standard approach in rock music. Years later, when music historians and guitar magazines began analyzing Keith Richards' influence on rock music, they often traced his most innovative techniques back to Chuck Berry. But Keith always insisted that Chuck's most important lesson wasn't technical. This philosophy became central to Keith's approach throughout his career. Whether he was playing a simple three-chord progression or a complex arrangement, Keith always focused on serving the song and expressing genuine emotion rather than showcasing technical skill. The thing Chuck taught me that changed everything wasn't about finger positions or timing, Keith reflected in a 2010 interview. It was about honesty. He taught me that the only way to make music that matters is to play what you feel, not what you think people want to hear. The story of Chuck Berry's lesson to Keith Richards has become legendary among musicians, but its significance goes beyond just guitar technique. It represents the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the way musical traditions evolve and grow through personal connections between artists. Today, guitar students around the world study Keith Richards' techniques, often without realizing they're learning lessons that originated with Chuck Berry in a cramped backstage area in 1963. Music schools teach courses on Keith's rhythm playing, analyzing the same approaches Chuck demonstrated that night. The influence of that 15-minute lesson can be heard in virtually every Rolling Stones song Keith Richards has played on. From the raw power of Painted Black to the intricate interplay of Gimme Shelter, Keith's guitar work consistently demonstrates the principles Chuck Berry taught him. Economy of expression, rhythmic sophistication, and emotional authenticity.